On the night of 22-23 July 1945, Barb lay off Karafuto while 8 American sailors slipped ashore under darkness, carrying a 55-pound demolition charge. A submarine had no business putting a landing party on Japanese soil. That was the point. Somewhere beyond the surf ran a railway Japan believed was safe. Somewhere ahead waited a result so strange it still sounds invented, and this same boat would soon become the first submarine to strike Japanese shore targets successfully with rockets. The thesis was simple. America turned stealth into attack, and attack into audacity. At the beginning of America's Pacific War, dread arrived in wreckage. Pearl Harbor had crippled the battle line, and the empire Japan had built across the ocean looked immense, organized, and far too secure to be unstitched quickly. The waters were wide, the distances were brutal, the enemy seemed to sit behind space itself. The submarines were not supposed to carry a war like that on their backs. They had been designed as scouts for a fleet that had suddenly been knocked out of action. Yet on 7 December 1941, the order went out to execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. The meaning was plain enough. If the surface fleet could not yet strike where it wished, boats beneath the surface would have to do it instead. The campaign that followed proved both how effective and how costly that choice was. United States submarines made 1,474 war patrols in the Pacific. They attacked 4,112 Japanese ships and sank 1,392 of them, a total of 5,583,400 tons. But the price was cruelly simple. 52 submarines lost in all causes, 41 lost on war patrol, and 3,484 dead. You do not fight a war like that from a safe distance. You fight it one patrol at a time. But statistics can flatten the human truth. To understand why Barb mattered, you first have to understand the kind of machine America sent into that darkness. Boats for distance, boats for patience. The fleet submarines that entered this war had been built for reach. They could stay out on patrol for about 56 days, and when forced deep into silence, they could endure submerged for about 36 hours at creeping speed. That phrase mattered. Creeping speed meant survival speed, the slow pace at which a submarine tried to become less a target than a rumor. Endurance meant stale air, restraint, and the discipline to wait longer than the enemy expected. Distance meant these boats could go where surface ships could not yet go, and remain where the enemy believed no threat could linger. Patience became a weapon before a torpedo ever ran. That was the architecture of undersea war. A submarine did not defeat an empire by announcing itself. It did so by making normal movement feel dangerous. A merchant route became a risk. A harbor approach became a calculation. A coastline became a place where men listened for what they could not hear. Remember that detail. Here is where it matters. The most important quality in a submarine campaign was not noise in the dramatic sense. It was absence. No warning, no visible line of attack, only impact. And absence required discipline. It required crews to trust instruments, procedure, timing, and one another while surrounded by water that could hide them or kill them. In that environment, temperament mattered almost as much as machinery, but a machine this patient still needed a mind equal to it. That mind arrived in the form of Eugene B. Fluckey, a commander for the dark, when Eugene B. Fluckey took command of Barb in May 1944. The submarine war was already proving its worth, but worth alone was not the same as distinction. Many boats fought hard, many crews endured. What set a commander apart was what he saw inside the same danger everyone else saw. Under Fluckey, caution did not disappear, it changed shape. He treated boldness as something to be measured, not admired. Reckless courage burns out quickly. Calculated aggression can compound. The first clear proof came fast. On the patrol that began on 21 May 1944, Barb was credited with sinking 472 tons of enemy shipping. That number mattered because it showed a commander taking a boat built for stealth and turning stealth into repeated effect. The patrol was not a lucky afternoon. It was a pattern. Hope entered the story here, but not triumph. Not yet. In war, a promising pattern is only as real as its performance under greater strain. Flucky had found a way to make Barb offensive without making her careless. That distinction deserves emphasis. There is a version of audacity that flares and dies. There is another version that studies, waits, and then strikes with unnerving clarity. Barb was becoming the second kind of threat, the kind that seemed to grow more dangerous precisely because it did not waste itself. He did not yet know how far Flucky was willing to go. During 5 war patrols, Flucky's initiative and aggressiveness cost the enemy at least 16 ships, along with many small craft and facilities ashore. Patrol after patrol, Barb stopped being merely one submarine among many and began to feel like a willful exception. But the sea punishes exceptions. The more successful a boat became, the more each future choice carried the weight of reputation. If defended waters seemed too dangerous, then perhaps that was precisely where surprise still lived. A harbor that should have been safe by early 1945, Barb and her commander were looking for a way to strike where the enemy felt structurally protected, not merely at sea. In place. That logic led toward Namquan Harbor on 23 January 1945. According to Flucky's Medal of Honor citation, he located a concentration of more than 30 enemy ships in the lower reaches of the harbor. To get at them, Barb had to run through waters described as uncharted, mined, and rock-obstructed. She did it in 5 fathoms of water. That measurement deserves a pause. 5 fathoms is the sort of margin that turns every choice into a commitment. There is not much room for error there. Inside that danger, Barb attacked. The boat fired its last forward torpedoes at 3,000-yard range, then brought its stern tubes to bear and fired again. The citation credited those attacks with 8 direct hits on 6 main targets. A large ammunition ship exploded, and the damage spread through the anchorage. Rising confidence entered the story here. If Pearl Harbor had opened the war with American ships caught exposed, Namquan Harbor showed an American submarine turning the idea of protected water back against the enemy. The geometry of dread had begun to reverse. That reversal mattered beyond the immediate damage. A harbor is supposed to compress security. It gathers ships under the assumption that concentration helps protection. Barb made concentration itself dangerous. Remember that detail. Here is where it matters. The enemy's safest arrangement had become a liability. But one successful penetration was still one patrol event. To grasp why Barb became more than a daring boat, you have to see how that same aggression reached outward as well as inward, into open water and against larger prey. Before Barb tested the enemy inside a harbor, she had already shown what the undersea war could do in open water. On 19 September 1944, Barb sank the escort carrier Uni. A submarine's great power was not spectacle. It was subtraction. Ships disappeared from the enemy's order of battle, escorts vanished, cargo vanished, options vanished. Each successful attack narrowed what Japan could protect, move, or replace. That is why the campaign statistics matter again. By the end, American submarines had sunk 1,392 Japanese ships, totaling 5,583,400 tons. An empire across water lives by movement. When movement becomes hazardous, empire becomes strain. And yet the numbers should not make the campaign seem easy. 41 submarines were lost on war patrol. 52 were lost in all causes. Every success lived inside that risk. Victory in this form did not feel triumphant from patrol to patrol. It felt conditional. That was why boats like Barb mattered beyond their own tonnage. They changed the enemy's sense of what had become unsafe. Open water was unsafe. Harbor water was unsafe. The pattern was widening. And if that widening pressure was already severe, what came next altered the emotional scale of the war. Barb would no longer limit herself to attacking ships that floated. She would reach for the shore. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the moment Barb stops merely hunting Japan at sea and starts striking the home islands themselves. Do not go anywhere. In the early morning hours of 22nd June 1945, Barb positioned herself about 3 miles from the center of Shari. Then she did something no submarine had yet done successfully against Japanese shore targets. She fired rockets. The superlative matters because it was earned in action, not attached afterward for effect. Barb became the first submarine to employ rockets successfully against Japanese shore installations. That was the promise planted early in this story, and here it paid off. But even that does not capture the larger shift. A submarine had traditionally threatened ships and sea lanes. Now one was reaching inland from offshore, turning the coastline into a firing line. Japan did not yet know the shoreline had become a front line. Think back to the campaign's first logic. Submarines were the force available when the battle fleet could not immediately answer Pearl Harbor. By June 1945, one of them was improvising a new kind of attack against the home islands themselves. That is a long journey in both confidence and imagination. Remember that detail? Here is where it matters. Absence was still the weapon. The rockets were dramatic, but the deeper shock lay in their origin. The attack came from a platform the enemy was not meant to have fixed in mind. Not on that shore, not in that role. But once a coastline has become targetable, the next temptation is obvious. If fire from the sea can reach land, then perhaps men from the sea can reach it too. On 19 July 1945, Flucky noticed a railroad running close to the Japanese coastline. He and Barb observed for 3 days to establish train schedules. Before daring, there was pattern. Before action, there was patience. Then came the decision that still sounds anomalous even when every part of it is documented. During the night of 22-23 July 1945, 8 crewmen went ashore under cover of darkness. Their target was a railway line. They planted a 55-pound demolition charge and returned to the boat, a submarine off Japan. A landing party in the dark, a line of track treated as if it belonged inside a naval war. It was, in every useful sense, an escalation. Then the charge did its work. The locomotive was thrown 200 feet. 12 freight cars, 2 passenger cars, and 1 mail car were wrecked. Barb had extended the submarine's reach from sea lane to harbor, from harbor to shore, and from shore into internal movement. The result mattered in 2 ways at once. It damaged a target. It also shattered an assumption. Naval war was supposed to stop at the edge of the water unless larger forces crossed that edge in strength. Here, a submarine crossed it in miniature and still left a mark large enough to remember. He did not yet know any of that. The men on that coast could not have stood inside the full pattern they were making. They knew the task. They knew the danger. They did not know how perfectly the mission would summarize the evolution of their boat. By the summer of 1945, the campaign that had once looked improvised had become systematic. Shipping had been hammered. Protected waters had been violated. Shore installations had been struck. Rail traffic along the coast had been sabotaged by men delivered from beneath the sea. You can feel the arc by now. The enemy first seemed too large to reach. Then it became possible to reach its shipping. Then its harbors. Then its shore. Then a railroad inland from that shore. Confidence had not arrived in a speech. It had arrived in widening circles of access. But the most dramatic single moment in Barb's war still remained the harbor run at Namquan. To understand why that act stands above even rockets and raiding parties, you have to go back into the channel and stay there until the boat comes out. The deepest tension in this story did not lie on the railway embankment. It lay in the harbor approach on 23 January 1945, where Barb entered the kind of water that punishes overconfidence and exposes hesitation. A concentration of more than 30 enemy ships waited in Namquan Harbor. Between Barb and those targets lay waters the citation described as uncharted, mined, and rock-obstructed. The boat pressed in anyway, riding in 5 fathoms. Not 5 fathoms beneath the problem, 5 fathoms inside it. This is where the campaign's themes converge. Endurance mattered because it had brought the boat there. Stealth mattered because it got her close enough to decide. Leadership mattered because decision at that range belonged to one commander and then to every man who had to execute it cleanly. Barb fired her last forward torpedoes at 3,000 yards. Then she turned and used the stern tubes, striking again. 8 direct hits on 6 main targets. A large ammunition ship exploded. The harbor, intended as a place of gathered security, became a place where concentration only multiplied damage. And then came the hardest part of any daring attack, leaving alive. A dramatic penetration is one thing, safe retirement through the same danger is another. The attack was bold. The escape completed it. That distinction is why this moment stands at the top of the story. The shore raid was strange. The rockets were historic. But Namquan Harbor demanded the full chain at once. Approach, nerve, precision, damage, and survival. Nothing in that sequence could be faked. Nothing in it could be recovered if it failed. That was the climax, because it compressed the entire war of the submarine into one episode. Silence became approach. Approach became contact. Contact became destruction. Destruction had to become disappearance again before the enemy could answer in full. He did not yet know how far Flucky was willing to go. By Namquan Harbor, the answer was plain. Far enough to invert the enemy's assumptions, far enough to make protected water feel exposed. But climax is not conclusion. The meaning of Barb's war is not that one boat performed miracles. It is that many patrols, multiplied across years, collapsed the enemy's edge. The collapse did not happen with a single explosion. It happened through accumulation. The Pacific Submarine Campaign made 1,474 war patrols. It attacked 4,112 Japanese ships. It sank 1,392 of them, totaling 5,583,400 tons. Japan was an empire sustained by movement across water. Once those routes grew dangerous, everything tightened. Shipping losses were not just losses of hulls. They were losses of fuel, cargo, timing, flexibility, and confidence. In war, routine is a form of power. Submarines attacked that routine until it broke. Barb fit into that larger pattern while also exceeding it. She finished the war credited with destroying 96,628 tons of enemy shipping. But Barb had done more than sink tonnage. She had shown range, adaptation, and nerve in forms that kept widening: open sea attack, harbor penetration, rocket strike, shore raid. Now think back to the opening dread. At Pearl Harbor, the United States had seen what exposure looked like when ships could not answer in time. By the end of this story, Japan faced a coastline, a harbor system, and a merchant lifeline that no longer felt secure. The direction of uncertainty had changed sides. That reversal is what the title's promise really means. America built a submarine so silent Japan never heard it coming, not because one boat moved like a ghost in legend, but because stealth had been refined into repeated strategic effect. Silence was not atmosphere. Silence was delivery. And the word delivery matters. The submarine did not need to occupy territory to change the war. It needed to arrive where the enemy assumed it would not, strike in a form the enemy had not fully prepared for, and vanish before a clean answer could be organized. But war leaves behind more than answers. It leaves methods, memories, and examples that outlive the emergency that produced them. Barb ended the war with a record large enough to invite exaggeration, yet the documented facts were already sufficient. She was credited with destroying 96,628 tons of enemy shipping. Under Eugene B. Fluckey, she became a submarine that repeatedly crossed from expected performance into historical exception. The exception was not random daring. It was disciplined adaptation. Barb showed that a submarine could do more than wait for ships in open water. It could violate a defended harbor. It could strike shore installations with rockets. It could deliver a raiding party to sabotage a railway on the night of 22-23 July 1945. Each act expanded what undersea power could mean. That is Barb's long-term legacy inside this war. She helped redefine the psychological and operational reach of the submarine within it. A coastline was no longer sanctuary just because it was land. A harbor was no longer safe merely because it was enclosed. A transport system was no longer immune because it ran on rails instead of through a sea lane. That legacy also clarifies the emotional arc of the whole story. Dread began with America damaged and reacting. Hope appeared when the submarines proved they could reach. Confidence rose when Barb kept widening the reach. The climax came when protected water failed to protect. The triumph was not noise, it was control. Japan did not yet know the shoreline had become a front line. By the time Barb proved it, the larger collapse was already underway. So how did America build a submarine so silent Japan never heard it coming? It built endurance into the hull, patience into the patrol, and under Fluckey, a ruthless clarity into the decisions. Then it kept sending boats into danger until stealth became pressure. Pressure became collapse, and collapse became victory. The quietest weapon can force the loudest collapse. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Like the video, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and we'll see you in the next one.